Late in 1940, a German U-boat crew was pulled from the icy North Atlantic. Their submarine now rested on the seafloor, and the shivering, terrified men were crammed into the hold of a British destroyer. They had heard stories, propaganda broadcasts that depicted British captors as ruthless and vengeful, ready to retaliate for every bombing raid on London. So when they finally set foot on British soil, herded into camps surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, they braced themselves for the worst. What they encountered, however, was something they could never have anticipated: a weekly ritual of confusion wrapped in newspaper, served promptly at 6 p.m. every Friday. These were the first P camps established in Britain's hastily assembled prisoner of war facilities during 1940 often repurposed old military sites or commandeered country estates to accommodate the war effort. By mid-1941, the UK held approximately 1,500 German captives, a figure that would swell to over 400,000 by the conflict's conclusion. These men arrived with preconceptions shaped by Dr. Goebbels' propaganda machine, anticipating torture, starvation, and humiliation. The Nazi propaganda ministry had spent years conditioning German soldiers to dread capture, circulating horrific tales of Allied brutality. So when these prisoners passed through camp gates and were handed tin plates, instructed to queue for meals, many assumed this was merely a temporary facade before the real punishment commenced. Camp routines were. The daily routine in the camp was firmly established from the outset. Réveil at dawn, work assignments throughout the day, and lights out by 10 p.m. The British Guards, many of whom were older men from the Home Guard or soldiers deemed unfit for frontline duty, maintained discipline without the cruelty the prisoners had anticipated. However, the real test came in the form of the food provided. Meals arrived on time, with portions measured according to International Red Cross guidelines that Britain adhered to, even as its own civilian population faced rationing. The German captors observed, biding their time, wondering when the situation would take a turn. Then, as the first Friday in the camp arrived, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. Guards who had been stern all week suddenly. The typical kitchen aromas of boiled greens and diluted tea had been supplanted by something entirely novel. Pungent scents of hot fat, salt, and vinegar permeated the air. Inmates observed the guards congregating near the camp kitchen with an enthusiasm uncharacteristic of their usual Monday mutton stew service. Some even exchanged light-hearted banter, smiling as they did so. When the food finally emerged, it was bundled in aged newsprint, leaving greasy ink smudges on the recipient's fingers. The Germans eyed these packages with profound distrust, anticipating some form of British retribution. The human psyche under duress instinctively seeks out patterns, especially those perceived as menacing. German POWs interned in British camps carried mental frameworks shaped by their wartime experiences. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years indoctrinating its soldiers with tales of enemy barbarity. Pamphlets distributed by Goebbels' ministry throughout 1939 and 1940 depicted Allied forces as sadistic, particularly in their treatment of prisoners. One widely circulated leaflet claimed British camps used starvation as official policy, feeding captives a mixture of animal feed and sawdust. Another suggested prisoners were subjected to scientific experiments involving deliberate malnutrition. These were not random scare tactics, but rather a concerted effort to make German soldiers fight harder, surrender less, and view everything through a lens of victimhood if captured. When these men encountered actual British rations, their interpretation was predictable. The unfamiliar food was, therefore, untrustworthy. The notion that anything non-German must be substandard had deep historical roots. During the First World War, German prisoners of war held in Britain had indeed suffered, not from deliberate cruelty, but from the naval blockade that left the entire nation malnourished. This generational memory persisted, passed down through families and military culture. Older German soldiers in 1940 sometimes had fathers who had been British captives in the previous conflict, and those fathers' accounts shaped their expectations. However, there was an additional factor. The German military's own treatment of prisoners created a psychological mirror. By 1941, the conditions in German prisoner of war camps, particularly those holding Soviet captives, had become catastrophic. Captivity under German rule proved devastating for Soviet prisoners of war. Of the 5.7 million Soviet captives, approximately 3.3 million perished, many succumbing to deliberate neglect and starvation. German soldiers were aware of this grim reality, even if they refrained from openly discussing it. This unconscious assumption, that the enemy must be treating their prisoners even more harshly, became a self-fulfilling expectation. When these German captives encountered the British food supply, it seemed to validate their worst fears, though for entirely erroneous reasons. Wartime rationing had transformed British cuisine into something unrecognizable, even to the British themselves. By 1942, butter was limited to a mere 2 ounces per person per week, meat to 1 shilling's worth, and sugar to 8 ounces. The Ministry of Food actively promoted new recipes to adapt to these severe shortages. The British wartime diet, shaped by the Dig for Victory campaign, became the staple fare for German prisoners of war as well. Powdered eggs, dried milk, and locally grown vegetables were common components of the meals served to both British families and their captive foes. While the Geneva Convention mandated adequate nutrition for prisoners, the German detainees perceived the boiled cabbage, reconstituted potatoes, and bread laced with oat flour as intentional efforts to demoralize them, anticipating further cruelty. However, the British were simply providing the same wartime rations consumed by their own citizens, prepared according to the constraints of the era. The morning meal was a grim affair, setting the tone for the day. Porridge resembling grey paste, tea strong enough to strip paint, and bread that crumbled like sawdust. One Luftwaffe pilot, Klaus Hartmann, even wrote in his diary that the breakfast looked like something scraped from a stable floor. The German prisoners sat in mesh halls, poking at their tin plates, faced with food that seemed intentionally designed to break their spirits. While the British wartime cooking had indeed become legendarily grim, the intent was not to demoralize, but rather a reflection of the scarcity and rationing of the time. Lunch brought a monotonous array of boiled vegetables, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and cabbage. The British culinary staff, often local female volunteers, dutifully followed the Ministry of Food's guidelines. Overcooked vegetables were considered safer, more digestible, and even patriotic. One 1941 recipe card recommended boiling cabbage for a staggering 25 minutes. The German prisoners, accustomed to the vibrant flavors and textures of sauerkraut, viewed these pale, limp vegetables as evidence of malicious intent. Some initially refused to eat, convinced the food was tainted or deliberately spoiled. Then came the truly perplexing items, such as the appearance of spotted dick on the menu at Camp 100 Tanks in Lancashire in October 1940. The German prisoners examined this steamed. The unfamiliar appearance and peculiar name of the suet-based dessert sparked bewilderment among the German prisoners of war. A Panzer commander, Friedrich Weber, reportedly expressed a strong aversion to consuming something labeled as dick, likening it to insulation material rather than food. However, a Yorkshire guard found the commander's reaction humorous, explaining that the dense, sweet pudding was a traditional British dessert, even made by his own mother. The American powdered eggs, shipped in vast quantities to Britain under the Lend-Lease program starting in 1941, also raised suspicions among the German captives, as the unfamiliar product seemed far removed from their culinary experiences. Wartime culinary practices were a source of intrigue and speculation among German prisoners of war. The reconstituted powdered eggs served to British guards possessed a peculiar texture and pungent aroma, leading the captives to ponder the palates and digestive fortitude of their captors. Some theorized that the British had either lost their sense of taste or had become accustomed to the unpalatable qualities of their own cuisine. Elaborate physiological explanations also circulated, suggesting the British stomach may have adapted to tolerate foods that would sicken the average person. The national wheat meal bread, introduced in 1942, was a distinct product of wartime rationing. Made from flour containing more of the wheat grain, this denser, darker loaf was a testament to the need to stretch limited supplies. The prisoners observed the British guards consuming these wartime provisions without apparent discomfort, fueling further speculation about the unique culinary constitution of their captors. Das Brot, das die Häftling als Ziegelstein, bezeichneten, war ein Produkt der Notwendigkeit. Bakker experimentierten mit Haferflocken, Kartoffelmehl und Sauger gemahlenen Bohnen, einen Leib zu schaffen, der so dicht und schwer war, dass als Terstopper hatte dienen können. Ein Häftling namens Otto Kraus, ein Backer aus Hamburg, betrachtet dieses Brot mit Entsetzen und erklärte seinen Mitgefangenen, dass es eine Sünde gegen den Weizen, gegen Gott und gegen Deutschland sei, in dieser Reihenfolge. Der Freitagmorgen begann wie jeder andere. Appell, Arbeitsverteilung, das übliche Trappeln von Stiefeln auf Kies und das Brüllen von Befehlen über den Lagerplatz. Doch bis zum Nachmittag änderte sich die Stimmung merklich. The guards appeared noticeably distinct, exuding a certain lightness and liveliness that contrasted with their demeanor just days prior. Clusters of them gathered near the kitchen block, engaged in conversations that radiated an energy previously absent. The German prisoners, ever vigilant behind the wire barriers, did not fail to observe these changes. When confined within such constraints, one becomes acutely attuned to even the slightest alterations in routine, for they may signal either peril or opportunity. A distinction that requires keen awareness. Around 4 o'clock, a vehicle arrived, unlike the typical supply lorry laden with canned provisions and sacks of potatoes. This was a smaller van, its side bearing inscriptions the prisoners could not decipher from their barracks. They watched as the guards unloaded wooden crates that steamed in the chilly air. The kitchen staff, typically methodical and joyless in their duties. The air in the 10-12 camp was abuzz with a sense of anticipation, as German whispers spread the word of something extraordinary unfolding. By 5:30, a peculiar scent wafted through the camp, cutting through the familiar odors of coal smoke, damp wool, and the stale aroma of unwashed men. This new aroma was a sharp, clean blend of hot oil and salt, with a savory, unfamiliar quality that was unmistakably the scent of real food, not the boiled, lifeless vegetables they had been subsisting on all week. Prisoners gathered at their barracks windows, straining to identify the source of this tantalizing smell. Some of the seasoned soldiers recognized the familiar aroma of frying from their own military kitchens, but this was different, richer, and more tantalizing. The British soldiers, who typically upheld a strict divide between themselves and the prisoners they oversaw, now found themselves in an unusual situation. Rather than maintaining their usual distance and formality, they were queuing up outside the kitchen, chatting and laughing like schoolchildren waiting for sweets. When the first soldiers received their parcels, neatly wrapped in newspaper, they didn't retreat to eat in private. Instead, they sat on the benches in full view of the prisoners, carefully unwrapping their prizes. Even a guard sergeant, known for his stern or weak demeanor, indulged in the contents of his parcel, breaking the mold of their typical disciplined behavior. The German captives observed the guards' peculiar behavior with mounting bewilderment. As the officers savored the contents of the steaming parcels, their visible delight puzzled the prisoners. One detainee, Hans Dietrich, leaned over to his cellmate, voicing the shared suspicion. "It's a ruse. They want us to witness their indulgence, only to then provide us with something far worse." When the time came for the evening rations, the inmates approached the serving hatch with profound exhaustion. To their surprise, the same newspaper-wrapped packages, still piping hot, were presented, their grease already oozing. The kitchen staff, comprising weary women and seasoned men, distributed the meals with their customary efficiency, devoid of any malice or smug satisfaction. The prisoners, reluctant to be the first to uncover the British's latest ploy, returned to the mess hall and eyed the steaming parcels, their newsprint wrappings curling slightly from the heat. Amid the silent standoff, a young 20-year-old submariner named Paul Schmidt, driven by hunger, resolved to confront whatever indignity or penalty awaited him. Each prisoner had received an identical ration to that of the guards, a gesture that elicited neither resentment nor triumph from the kitchen staff. The parcels sat on the tables, their contents a mystery that the German soldiers were hesitant to unveil, fearing further humiliation at the hands of their captors. Eventually, the gnawing pangs of hunger compelled them to act, and Paul Schmidt, a young man barely out of his teens, decided to take the risk and discover what the British had devised. Eager to escape the persistent discomfort of his stomach, he cautiously unwrapped the parcel, peeling back the pages of the 2-day-old Daily Mirror. Beneath the newsprint, he discovered something golden brown and still faintly crackling with residual heat, two distinct components. One was clearly fish, its white, flaky flesh encased in a coating that appeared almost architectural, ridged and crispy. The other was a potato, but not the familiar boiled cubes they had been subsisting on. These were thick-cut and golden, a far cry from the meager fare they had endured in recent days. With the edges darkened and caramelized, the insides were light and steaming as he broke one open at 1337. Salt crystals glistened in the light, and there was a liquid present. He cautiously touched it at 1343, then brought it to his nose. Sharp and acidic, yet not unpleasant, vinegar, he realized, though more assertive than the delicate varieties his mother used on Sunday salads back in Bavaria. Schmidt lifted the fish piece at 1355. It was still hot enough to necessitate careful handling. First, he bit through the batter, savoring the satisfying crunch, a texture that likely activated something primal in the human brain, a remnant from when our ancestors discovered fire and crispy foods became possible. The coating shattered into shards, and then his teeth met the. Savoring the unexpected delicacy, Schmidt relished the mild, clean flavor of the fish, its tender flesh protected by the crisp batter. Defying his preconceptions, the simple meal proved genuinely satisfying, prompting him to dip a chip into the vinegar-laced condiment and savor the experience. As he chewed thoughtfully, the entire group observed his shifting expression, captivated by his sensory revelation. The potato's interior disintegrated into a light, airy texture, while its outer layer retained its crisp, 1502 robust structure. The vinegar's acidity counterbalanced the oil, creating a harmonious flavor that compelled one to immediately crave another mouthful. Around 1509, other inmates in the hall began unwrapping their parcels, and a collective realization swept through the space like a ripple. Otto 1515 Kraus, the baker who had condemned British bread as a wartime offense, took a bite of his fish and unexpectedly let out a 1521 surprised chuckle, startling everyone, including himself. Friedrich Weber, who had previously rejected the spotted dick, 1528 consumed his entire portion in under 3 minutes, then spent the next 5 licking grease from his fingers and 1533 staring at the empty newspaper with an expression akin to grief. The 1539 guards observed this spectacle. The sergeant strolled through the dining area, outwardly verifying discipline, but secretly relishing the sight of German captives discovering a quintessential British culinary tradition. Friday was a special day, as it meant the beloved fish and chips would be served. One prisoner, Ernst Müller, called out to the sergeant in halting English. This weekly ritual was well known to the officer, who acknowledged it with a nod each Friday. Müller relayed the news to his tablemates, eliciting an immediate reaction. 7 hardened soldiers, who had endured combat and imprisonment while upholding order, now broke into genuine smiles. The scientific explanation was simple: the fat, salt, and Maillard reaction, which browns food and creates complex flavors, triggered pleasure receptors in their brains. The crisp, freshly prepared meal stimulated the prisoners' sensory receptors in a way that the soft, boiled fare they were accustomed to could not. Crucially, witnessing the guards consume the same dish helped dissolve the psychological barrier between the two groups. This was no longer a matter of us versus them, it was simply another Friday. Within a matter of days, correspondence began flowing out of the camps, facilitated by the International Red Cross. While all letters were carefully screened by military censors on both sides, looking for intelligence leaks or security risks, what neither side anticipated was the deluge of commentary about these Friday dinners. Oloid Heinrich Vogel, for instance, wrote enthusiastically to his wife about the experience. Stoggart, November 1941. You'll scarcely believe what I must divulge. The British have a peculiar tradition. Without fail, Every Friday at 6:18 p.m., they indulge in a meal of fish fried in a crisp, doughy crust, accompanied by potatoes prepared in a manner I cannot adequately describe. This same fare is consumed by the guards. Yes, Maria, the same. I witnessed a British sergeant, a British private, and a German corporal all partaking from identical parcels. For 20 minutes on Friday evenings, there are no adversaries in this camp, only men savoring fish. His spouse safeguarded that letter for 4 decades, preserving it between the pages of a family Bible. The archives at London's Imperial War Museum house hundreds of such accounts. The personal papers of a former prisoner, meticulously preserved and catalogued years later, reveal a striking evolution in the correspondence. Initial suspicion gradually gave way to confusion, then a reluctant appreciation, and finally, a sense of anticipation. In March 1942, Paul Schmidt wrote to his mother, questioning whether his eagerness for his captor's meals on Fridays made him a collaborator. Yet, he explained, after enduring 6 days of monotonous gray rations, the Friday fare brought a welcome burst of color, warmth, and intentionality to his palate. Records from detention facilities across Britain corroborate this behavioral shift. At Camp 21 in Comrie, Scotland, the commanding officer noted in his journal from July 1942, the warden noted a distinct decline in disciplinary incidents starting from Wednesday each week. It seemed the prisoners moderated their behavior in anticipation of the Friday meal privileges, though this was not an official policy. While the standard ration was simply fish and chips, the psychological impact was undeniable. Similar patterns emerged in other camps, where inmates volunteered for extra work details on Thursdays to earn their Friday meal, despite it not being a conditional arrangement. The ritual had acquired a significance beyond mere sustenance. Some prisoners even requested British cookbooks through the Red Cross, including a signals officer from Munich named Veer, who wrote multiple letters to his sister asking her to research information on the batter process for fried fish. The Englishman harbored ambitious culinary plans for the post-war era. He confided to his sister his intention to establish a Bavarian restaurant serving authentic British Friday fare. His sibling deemed the notion utterly ludicrous. Automated systems flagged the correspondence as potentially suspicious, speculating the term, battered, might conceal some hidden meaning. However, the poor fellow appeared genuinely fixated on fried fish. This preoccupation ran deeper than mere gastronomic preference. It reflected a broader psychological state. These men existed in a state of limbo, as the war raged on without them, their futures uncertain and their loved ones facing perils beyond their control. Friday became a reliable source of comfort amidst the chaos. Dr. Franz Becker, a military psychologist, observed this phenomenon. A medical professional apprehended at Tobruk in 1942 and confined at a facility in Darbashire, recorded in his diary at 8:10 p.m. Even in prolonged hardship, the human spirit requires small acts of kindness to endure. I did not anticipate the British would comprehend this sentiment. Yet, here we are. Each Friday, a modest gesture of compassion 8:22 arrives wrapped in newsprint. Some guards began elucidating the tradition's background. They described how fish and chips evolved into a 8:29 staple sustenance for the working class in Victorian England. They explained how the Catholic custom of meatless Fridays merged with affordable 8:35 street food. The prisoners listened intently, posing queries and drawing parallels to their own culinary 841 heritages. These conversations represented a rare occurrence amidst the ravages of war. Adversarial soldiers discussing matters 847 beyond conflict, finding common ground in something as. The Geneva Convention of 1929 set forth explicit guidelines regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. Captives were to be provided sustenance equivalent in quality and quantity to that supplied to the detaining power's own troops. Britain's adherence to these provisions was not driven by altruism, but rather by calculated self-interest. The rationale was that British prisoners held in German camps would receive treatment proportional to how Germany's captives were faring in British custody. By 1942, around 170,000 British Commonwealth soldiers were in German hands. Their chances of survival hinged partly on reciprocal maintenance of minimum standards, though implementation varied greatly depending on the specific adversary. Prisoners on the Western Front, whether British, American, or French, generally received treatment roughly aligned with the Geneva Guidelines in German camps. The conditions in German prisoner of war camps, known as stalags, were often harsh and inadequate, but nonetheless survivable for British and American captives. Tragically, the story was vastly different for Soviet prisoners of war. The German treatment of these individuals, driven by a twisted racial ideology that viewed Slavic peoples as subhuman, amounted to systematic extermination through neglect. At the notorious Stalag 326 in Stukenbrock, over 65,000 Soviet prisoners perished by the war's end, primarily from starvation and disease that their captors could have prevented. This grim statistic stands in stark contrast to the relatively lower mortality rate of around 4% among Western Allied prisoners. The stark disparity reflects the cruel arithmetic of wartime detention, as well as the fact that the Soviet Union had not signed the Geneva Convention, granting Germany a perceived license to disregard the basic rights and welfare of its Eastern Front captives. The decision to withhold adequate sustenance from prisoners was rooted in an ideological agenda rather than legal justification. Some German detainees in British camps had witnessed or participated in the Soviet system, where prisoners of war received a meager 700 calories per day, just enough to prolong their suffering, but not to sustain life. These men had observed their comrades resorting to consuming grass, bark, and other desperate measures to fill their empty stomachs. When these same German soldiers found themselves in British camps, receiving 2,500 to 3,000 calories daily, the stark contrast evoked a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. Hans Dietrich, a prisoner who had previously suspected the Friday fish ration was a ruse, had served in Ukraine in 1941. He wrote to a fellow captive, who had been apprehended at the same time and was now held in a different facility. The British camp commanders adhered to a principle dictated by the War Office, treating prisoners as temporarily detained soldiers entitled to dignity within the constraints of security. In contrast, the German doctrine on the Eastern Front viewed prisoners as defeated enemies, their labor and lives forfeit to the Reich's needs. This disparity in treatment reflected a deeper philosophical divide, one that extended beyond mere caloric intake. As more prisoners arrived from the North African theater by 1943, the British officer grappled with the unsettling realization that the actions of his own forces did not align with the enemy he had been instructed to fight. This profound disconnect left him questioning the very nature of his comrades and the adversary they confronted. The British camps in the African theater had developed intricate organizational structures for prisoners. Inmates could arrange educational sessions, stage theatrical performances, and receive musical instruments through the Red Cross. At Camp 186 in Lanascher, a full orchestra was formed, with 23 German musicians playing Beethoven for both British guards and their German counterparts. This camp also provided fish and chips every Friday without fail until 1944. Even as V-2 rockets bombarded London, the prisoners were keenly aware of the stark contrast in their treatment. Luftwaffe pilot Klaus Hartmann, who had initially griped about the porridge resembling stable refuse, wrote in December 1943, "We are treated better as enemies than we treated conquered peoples as victors." This realization weighs heavily, evoking thoughts of the Polish families whose homes were requisitioned. In the year 1939, a German soldier's letter, penned while interned in a British camp, provided a rare glimpse into the moral quandaries faced by those caught in the throes of war. Though the missive never made it past the censors, its survival in camp records bore witness to the profound reckoning unfolding in real time. The weekly ritual of fish and chips, shared equally by British guards and German prisoners, became a symbolic representation of a larger principle, a declaration that the captors were distinct from their foes, upholding standards of humane treatment even when the enemy did not. For some German prisoners of war, this was a novel encounter with the notion that military might could coexist with moral fortitude. The war's conclusion in May 1945 did not immediately lead to the prisoners' homecoming. Repatriation often took months, even years, to complete. German POWs remained in British camps throughout 1946 and 1947, assisting with agricultural labor and infrastructure reconstruction efforts. During this peculiar transitional phase, where they were no longer adversaries but not yet fully liberated, the Friday fish and chips ritual persisted. For some, this had become as much their custom as it was Britain's, after years of partaking in the weekly tradition. As repatriation finally commenced, certain prisoners asked to enjoy one last Friday meal before departing on their trains. The final contingent of German detainees at Camp 18 in Featherston Park, Northland, departed in February 1948, receiving fish and chips wrapped in newspaper for their journey home. Sergeant Roberts, who had overseen the facility since 1941, bid farewell to the men he had guarded for 7 years, with some prisoners confessing they would miss the routine more than any other aspect of their captivity. In the ensuing decades, a surprising trend emerged, as former prisoners began returning to Britain as tourists during the 1950s and 1960s. Some sought out battlefields or memorials, while others specifically searched for the camps where they had been interned. Vera, the signals officer who had requested British cookbooks, never did open his Bavarian restaurant in the aftermath of the war. Post-war Germany had more pressing concerns than introducing British-style fried cuisine. However, in 1962, he returned to Britain with his family, driving to Derby to locate the shop that had supplied his former camp. As he savored the familiar cod and chips, his daughter Greta later recounted, he wept quietly, though the reasons remained unspoken. Heinrich Vogel, who had written to his wife about the guards and prisoners consuming identical meals, became a schoolteacher in Stoggard after the conflict. He taught English and history, and each year, he would recount to his students the tale of how the camp's meals had been indistinguishable, regardless of one's role. In the early 1970s, Vogel orchestrated an educational excursion to Britain for his students. While the official itinerary included iconic landmarks like the Tower of London and Stratford-upon-Avon, his true intention was to introduce the young Germans to the delights of fish and chips. Vogel took his group to a shop in Lancaster, near the site of his former camp, and treated the 30 teenagers to this quintessential British fare. As they sat on a bench, their hands stained with newspaper grease and the pungent aroma of vinegar filling the crisp autumn air, Vogel imparted a valuable lesson. That adversaries are not innate, but rather constructed, and what is built can also be dismantled. Decades later, academic studies by Dr. Sarah Matthews would corroborate the profound impact of this simple culinary experience. The University of Manchester's groundbreaking 1998 study delved into the psychological significance of food during the Second World War. Through interviews with surviving German prisoners, the research uncovered consistent themes. The weekly ritual of shared sustenance provided a sense of structure, predictability, and, most crucially, a tangible expression of our common humanity. As one subject, E. Sepp Klenny, poignantly remarked, "When you consume the same nourishment as your captor, the illusion of being a distinct species dissolves. The potato cares not whether it nourishes a German or an Englishman, nor does the fish." Across Britain, modern fish and chip shops proudly display black and white photographs from the 1940s, capturing the iconic scenes of people patiently queuing, newspapers tucked under their arms, awaiting their Friday food parcels. Some establishments near the remnants of past encampments now feature commemorative plaques that recount their wartime function as sustenance hubs for both guards and detainees. In the Scottish town of Comrie, a local eatery proudly displays a framed letter from a former prisoner who visited in 1983, expressing gratitude for providing comfort through familiar cuisine to a homesick young man unaware of the solace enemy food could offer. The last verified German prisoner held in Britain, Otto Fischer, passed away in 2019 at the age of 97. His family recounted that until his final days, he steadfastly insisted on fish and chips prepared precisely as he recalled from his captivity: crisp batter, proper fries, malt vinegar, and salt wrapped in newsprint, despite regulations no longer permitting such practices. When questioned about his unwavering adherence to this ritual, 7 decades after liberation, he remarked plainly, It reminds me that individuals are just individuals, even when authorities claim otherwise. That lesson exacts a heavy toll in human lives to comprehend. I commemorate it every Friday. His local German journal published the obituary alongside an image of Fisher at 23 in British custody and at 95 clutching a parcel of fish and chips. Grinning, the identical smile in both shots. The grin of someone who uncovered an unanticipated truth and resolved never to disregard it.